Thanks for having me once again. I appreciate the opportunity to come out and talk with you about some of the things I'm learning. And as you know, if you've been here with me before, I've been learning a lot about being a minor character in God's kingdom and how being a minor character can have a major impact. And I find in myself that I fall into some traps that minor characters tend to do. Maybe let's call it sidekick syndrome. Sometimes I get the great idea that I should just put on Superman's cape and muscle my way through any of life's situations, and I miss the opportunity to point people to Jesus, the real hero. Other times, I don't even lace up my shoes and get in a fight because I hold back and say, no, there's not any way that God could use me in this situation. There's no way that I could help or guide, or these people probably don't even want my help or my prayers right now. And I fall into those two traps, and I think part of it is I'm not a student of my own game. Now, I'm a fan of frisbee golf. Anyone in here play frisbee golf? I don't call it disc golf, even though that's what it's supposed to be called, because usually when I introduce people to it, they say disco, and they get all kinds of ideas that I don't want them to. But frisbee golf works just like golf. You have 18 holes, and your goal is to get it into the target in a certain number of strokes, except instead of a club and golf balls, you use different frisbees. I have more frisbees than any human should, because I fall into this trap thinking that, ooh, this one will help me get better at my game. And I can throw pretty far. But then if you put trees in my way, I would make a better lumberjack than a disc golfer. My wife's family is all into disc golf. It's our family sport, and so they introduced me to it, and I got to playing with them enough that I thought, boy, I'm pretty good. I can handle this. And then
ran into the trees.
I competed with some local guys who have, disc golf clubs and regular leagues. And I came in 31 out of 32. And the only other guy that was worse than me had never been to the course before. And I didn't even have that excuse. And I've learned this about myself, that if I were a student of my own game, I would be a lot better. You can learn a lot about your bad habits when throwing a frisbee if you watch a slow motion video of yourself. You can diagnose your form and your errors, because throwing a frisbee is not about muscling it. It's about technique, and I don't have good technique. But also, I'm too embarrassed to watch myself throw. You guys can see that I have permanently red cheeks. I do suffer from all kinds of embarrassing things, whether it's in what I say or in what I think. And so it embarrasses me to watch someone do something that I'd be scared to do. Like, even if it's in a movie, I will get embarrassed for a character, let alone pay attention to my own mistakes. Little confession for you. I don't go back to your Facebook page or your website and watch my own sermons, mostly because I can't stand the sound of my own voice. Okay? I sound a lot cooler listening to myself, talk right now than I do watching it back. I even asked my coworker, my science teacher, why is that? Why does my voice sound so different when I'm hearing it on a video? He said, well, when you're talking, your voice actually reverberates inside your head and makes you sound a lot deeper than you actually are. And so what I took from that was there's nothing in my head, my voice just echoes around in there, and that there probably wasn't much for me to listen to anyway. But we get ourselves in trouble when we aren't students of our own game, when we aren't watching ourselves and diagnosing the things that we need to work on. I could be a lot better if I were to watch myself play. I could be a lot better if I were to watch myself speak. And I think there are things in our lives that if we were careful to examine, we could be a lot better minor characters in the kingdom of God. If we, as a church, as people who follow Jesus, treat mirrors like this instead of giving them an opportunity to see what things need fixed, we can get ourselves into trouble in the kingdom of God. It's kind of like we're hiking without a compass. You don't always need a compass when you're hiking. Lots of trails are very clearly blazed. But when you need a compass, you need it bad, right? And without a compass, without examining where we're going, we can get into a lot of trouble. Sure, we could pass it off like, yeah, I can find my way back to the trail this way. Or we can pretend to be self-assured to give those people with us some confidence. But what we'll end up doing is heading in the wrong direction, most likely. And so if we, as people who follow Jesus, aren't studying our own game, aren't examining ourselves, and aren't saying, how am I doing? We run the risk of pointing people to the wrong Jesus, or coming to them with wrong attitudes, and pretending like we don't need to follow Jesus and look more like him every day. And so I want to warn us against that, but give us some hope too. Because we're going to meet a minor character who does a really good job at recognizing Jesus. And he actually confronts the disciples with their inability to examine their own hearts. This guy's name is Bartimaeus. He's the only minor character that we're going to talk about who has a name in all of the Gospels. He's the only person that Jesus heals who's given a name, and we're going to talk about why that is. But our goal is to see if we can examine our own game through the lens of Bartimaeus' situation. So the disciples are confronted with something that they need to be well-versed in. Jesus' goal. Jesus is heading to Jerusalem. When I talked to you last time, I said Jesus had turned toward Jerusalem and he was beginning his final trip to the cross. And he's almost there when we see this Bartimaeus story. But the disciples still aren't clear on where Jesus is going. They're more worried about who they're going to be in the kingdom of God than what Jesus is about to do to accomplish his work in the kingdom. They have no clue how far they need to grow. And it takes a blind man to show them where they need to be looking. That's where we're heading. So if you'll open up your Bible to Mark chapter 10 with me, we're going to be looking at verses 46 to the end of the chapter there in 52. And let's read this passage together. It says, "Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, 'Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me.' Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' So they called to the blind man, 'Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you.' Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up to his feet and came to Jesus. 'What do you want me to do for you?' Jesus asked him. The blind man said, 'Rabbi, I want to see.' 'Go,' said Jesus, 'your faith has healed you.' Immediately, he received his sight and followed Jesus." So this situation, I'm too far, sorry about that. See what happens when you can't see. This situation has Jesus on his last lap to Jerusalem. And throughout chapter 10 in Mark, we see him discussing what it really means to be a disciple, someone who follows. That's what a disciple is. A disciple is someone who's called by a teacher to follow them and learn everything that they can. And so Jesus has spent all this time in Mark trying to prepare his disciples for what's about to happen. And in his crucifixion and his resurrection. And they're still not getting it. So in chapter 10, he's discussing in a couple different ways what discipleship means. And basically, he's saying discipleship is important in all of life's circumstances. He talks to them about marriage because some people were challenging him with questions on divorce. And so discipleship is important in our most important relationships. Being a follower of Jesus is important in those most important things. He puts young children before them, people who would have been cast out of most major adult conversations in Jewish culture. And he tells them that discipleship is important in front of children and how you raise your family. Following is important in that circumstance. And then he deals with a man who is so in love with his own possessions that he can't give them up to follow Jesus. And so in our marriage, in our families, and in all that we own, that should be a part of following Jesus. And then he does something that he's already done once before. He says, I'm about to be delivered up to be crucified. And his disciples then naturally fall in line, don't they? They're like, okay, we know what it's going to take. No, not in Mark. His disciples immediately begin fighting with one another over who's going to be the most important in the kingdom. James and John, in the passage right before our passage, are arguing and saying, what's it going to take for us to sit at your right hand and your left hand in your kingdom? Rather than focusing on following now, they're worried about awards later. They're like me. They're not looking at the game that's happening now. They're just dreaming of being on the podium at the end. And they're missing out what it takes to really be a disciple. But thankfully, and fortuitously, Jesus brings them a minor character who shows them what it means to be a disciple. And we're going to see that Bartimaeus knows who Jesus is without question. Bartimaeus also knows what he needs from Jesus. He knows his own game. He knows his weaknesses. He knows what he needs. And he's unafraid to follow Jesus, knowing where he's going. And so we jump into this story, and we see verse 46 says, Then they came to Jericho. And as Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting along the roadside begging. That's the scene we're in. Jesus has gone through Jericho, and Jericho is the kind of major fort city before Jerusalem. If you're a fan of the Old Testament, you might remember Joshua coming into Israel, crossing the Jordan, and then immediately conquering Jericho. The reason Joshua had to conquer Jericho is because it blocked the central route into the Judean highlands, which is where most of the population lived in that area. It protected the Canaanites and then the Israelites from invasion from the sea and also from the Arabian Peninsula. And so Jericho was at a major juncture. And if you were going to Jerusalem like Jesus was, you had to go through Jericho. You could have gone along the sea route, but that would have taken you through Samaria. And Jewish people and Samaritan people, they weren't good friends. They would go all the way around the Jordan River, cross at Jericho, and go up to Jerusalem. And it's Passover time. So every good Jewish family was going to Jerusalem. This road was crowded, and Bartimaeus was there in the best begging place that he could be. He wasn't probably welcome in the city, and so he was on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem in hopes that as Israelites went to celebrate the Passover, which was when God had great mercy on them, that they would be generous and throw some money his way, because he couldn't work. It's hard to be a shepherd when you can't see the sheep, especially in the territory of Jericho. Too many hills, lots of cliffs, very dangerous place for someone who can't see. And so he's sitting there waiting for handouts. And it would have been normal for people on festival time to help him. But he was pushed to the side of the crowd, and Jesus has to call him to come closer. Now, we've been talking all these minor characters, and I've been telling you who they are based on their relationship with other people, but this Bartimaeus guy gets a name. He's the only character Jesus heals in all the Gospels who gets a name, and his name is actually the son of Timaeus, his dad. But Mark points that out twice. He calls him Bar-Timaeus, which in the language would have been the son of Timaeus. And then he tells his reader again he was the son of Timaeus. So probably Timaeus and Bartimaeus were figures in the church that Mark was writing his gospel to. These were probably people who became lifelong disciples and followers of Jesus. And so when Mark was writing down his story, people would have known about this guy. And so they called him out by name specifically. And so if Jesus calls specific attention to this, and Mark says twice, pay attention to this dude, we better pay attention. As people who want to be disciples of Jesus, right? If we're following Jesus, we should pay attention to the stuff that he calls important. And so we see this, and Bartimaeus is begging. But then when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Now, I was interested. What did it mean that Bartimaeus heard? Was it just, that was the sense that was most useful for him, his hearing, and he heard the crowd? Probably. But he had probably also heard about Jesus because people had come from Jerusalem, gone northward to Galilee, and were investigating Jesus. He was causing a stir, and people were getting uncomfortable. So Bartimaeus would have heard of this guy. And then Bartimaeus recognizes him by two particular names. He calls him, in what our modern translations usually say, Jesus of Nazareth. That's actually not probably the most accurate translation. Nazareth was Jesus' hometown. After the birth story, he goes up to Nazareth around Galilee, and he's hanging out at his would you call Joseph his dad, his stepdad?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. But he's hanging out at his carpentry shop, learning the trade, right? He's from the town of Nazareth. But this word is probably closer to the Old Testament Nazarene. And a Nazarene was someone who decided that they would take a specific vow to live their life a certain way to be set apart for God. There were certain things that Nazarenes wouldn't do, certain things Nazarites wouldn't do, and certain things they would do in order to be used of God. And Jesus is called Jesus the Nazarite. This word would have held significance to that culture. They would have known that this is an important person set aside for the mission of God. Bartimaeus recognizes that about Jesus, though he's never seen him. He's heard enough about Jesus to know this guy's set apart for a specific purpose of God. Now, earlier in the chapter, Jesus had told his disciples that specific purpose. I'm going to be delivered up to be crucified, and on the third day I will rise again. And rather than saying, okay, tell us what that's about, I need more information, I'm a little nervous, they say, well, so you're going to be crucified, who's going to be the greatest then? Who's the next greatest? Is it me? Is it my brother? Can we be the greatest? Whereas Bartimaeus already knows this guy's set apart for a specific mission. Then he calls him Son of David. To us, we're like, okay, that doesn't mean much. He's referencing David in the Old Testament, but Son of David in this time had a very specific meaning. It was the king that was promised. Israel hadn't had a king for nearly 600 years. And David was the king that they all looked up to as the best king. And Bartimaeus says Jesus is his son, his descendant. But it was also a title that the Jewish rebels would have used to strike fear into the heart of the Roman oppressors. Because this son of David was supposed to deliver Israel from all of her enemies. And so when Jesus gets called this, he's set aside for God's purpose, and his purpose is to deliver Israel from her enemies. Throughout the rest of Mark, if someone calls Jesus this, he says, shh, don't tell anybody yet, it's not time. He tells demons, don't say who I am. When people recognize him, he says no. Bartimaeus calls out, and Jesus doesn't say, be quiet. He says, come here. Because Bartimaeus has recognized who Jesus is when his disciples really haven't yet. And Bartimaeus is calling out, Jesus of Nazareth, Son of David, have mercy on me. Now, we might think mercy is you see someone in a situation and you help them out. You know they have a need. You're merciful to give them something that you have to help them. That's not what this word is. It's not give me money. It's not give me physical help. Have mercy on me is the phrase that would have been used when people were mourning the sins they had committed and calling out for God to forgive them. That's what Bartimaeus is doing. Jesus has outlined his plans to his disciples, and they don't get the plan. Bartimaeus can't even see Jesus, and he knows that he is set aside for God's purpose, that the purpose is delivering people, and that he is capable of fixing both physical and spiritual needs. That's what Bartimaeus says in this. And if we just look at it on a surface level, it might seem like he knows who this guy is. No, he knows the exact plan of God. And he's never seen Jesus. And the crowd, rather than doing what they should have done during festival time and help him out, they rebuke him. Verse 48 says, many rebuked him and told him to be quiet. Bartimaeus didn't listen. It says, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. These crowds would have been used to beggars. In a farming community like that, if you have some kind of difficulty or disability, you're of no good to their society. You can't work, and so you can't help out, and so you're a burden. The other cultures of the area would have put those people outside of town and let them go. Israel had a different law. They were set up to help people like that. Farmers would leave some of their fields for people who weren't able to work so that they could eat. Every 7 years, there was a cycle of forgiving debts and helping people, reestablishing that the poorest in society should be given a spot at the king's table. But these people were so used to beggars that they were used to ignoring. And they knew. It was like, I'm preparing to take some of my middle schoolers to Philadelphia. Some of them have never been in a town with more than 1.5 stoplights. Right, Housedale? And so I told them, guys, a couple things. Always know where your wallet is. And if someone asks you for money, keep walking. Not that people don't need help, right? But there are a lot of people who are really good at separating tourists from their wallets really quickly. And so that would have been the Israelites' attitude toward Bartimaeus. Hey, we're going to town. We know there's going to be beggars there. Don't even mess with them. But Bartimaeus is not going to stop. He continues to say, this is the Son of David. Have mercy on me. Save me. And Jesus stops. And he says, call him. So they called the blind man and said, cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. Why does Jesus pay attention to his need? Jesus heals a lot of people. But Bartimaeus gets particular significance. Because Jesus uses him to show his disciples, this is what someone who follows me looks like. He knows who I am. You guys haven't figured that out yet. And watch what I can do in the life of someone who knows who I am. Verse 50, we see Bartimaeus charging Jesus. He throws away his cloak, he jumps to his feet, and rushes into the road to meet Jesus. Mark highlights him throwing aside his cloak because it would have encumbered him. He takes it off and runs to Jesus. He's pursuing him with no regard for how the crowd was viewing him, and nothing would get in Bartimaeus' way. He's already shown that. And when he gets to Jesus, Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? I was curious, why would Jesus ask this question? But he seems to ask this question throughout the rest of the stories we've talked about. What do you need? And he gives the person a chance to be heard and recognized. But it also lets everybody watching know, here's the problem. Jesus has the ability to fix it. And Bartimaeus recognizes something amazing about Jesus in his response here too. Not only does he know that he's the Messiah, not only does he know that he's set apart for God's special purpose, but he says this. The blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. That rabbi word there is a little difficult for us in English too. Usually it just means teacher, saying Jesus is a teacher, but Bartimaeus uses an old school word. He's, and pardon my chagrin at this, but he's speaking King James Version to Jesus right now. And that's not a knock on anybody's translation that you might have. It's just, it's not necessarily the language that Jewish people of his time would have used. And he's actually quoting a Psalm of David when David cries out for mercy for God. That rabbi, the word is actually Rabboni. It was only used in prayers to God. And it is Most High Teacher. teacher who is clearly divine. God, you are my teacher. That's what he's saying to Jesus. So he recognizes he's set apart for God's purpose. He recognizes that Jesus is the king who will deliver Israel, and he recognizes that Jesus is divine. All of the things that the disciples have been struggling with, Bartimaeus recognizes. And then he says what he needs. I need to see. I'm no good if I can't see. Now, whether Bartimaeus was blind from birth, or whether he was made blind in an accident or through macular degeneration or whatever it might be, we don't know. But Bartimaeus knows he needs to see. He has a physical need. He asks Jesus to fix it. And Jesus says, go. Your faith has healed you. Immediately, he received his sight and followed Jesus down the road. I was curious here because Jesus said to him, go. And Bartimaeus didn't go. He followed Jesus. And so we see another lesson from Bartimaeus, that Bartimaeus knows who Jesus is, he knows what he needs, and he follows Jesus. I was curious what it meant for him to follow Jesus, because there's a crowd going to Jerusalem. Everybody who's a good practicing Jewish person would be going to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. It's a big deal. And so I looked around and did some research, and people aren't sure whether that meant he just went with the crowd because that's where everybody was going, or whether he went on to be a disciple of Jesus. But I'm thinking, and I could be wrong, that because his name is mentioned twice when he's introduced, that Bartimaeus was probably a bigwig in the first century church. Like, people would have known when Mark was writing his gospel, oh, that's Bartimaeus? It'd be like, let's pretend that Terry told you terrible stories about a kid in youth group back in the day. You know, he's even here. Oh, there he is. Yeah. And he told you all the stupid stuff that used to happen. And then I showed up and you're like, hey, remember that story that I told you don't ever do that because that's what he did? Yeah, that's him. Right? These people probably knew who Bartimaeus was. So chances are he became a disciple who followed Jesus. And so for us, if we know that we need to be students of our own game, and we see this guy as a display put before these disciples who aren't sure where they're going and are just squabbling about who's going to be the best and who's in charge and who's the real boss, if Bartimaeus is the example that Jesus puts in front of them, we can learn some stuff. Can't we, church? We can examine our own game. And so, if you're someone who's been following Jesus for a while, there's stuff here in Bartimaeus' story that you can learn, or at least you can use to make sure you're following well. And so, church, I want to ask you, is this a place where Jesus is known and proclaimed and people know who he is? Now, I know the answer to that. I've known you in the past, and I know you now, and you want Jesus to be known. It's your mission statement, right? Making disciples for Jesus in Mo Valley. Did I butcher it? Is it right on the wall behind me? Yeah. Could I have simply turned around and looked at it? Making disciples in Mo Valley. I added the Jesus part, but that's probably a good thing. I like it. It's easy to remember. But that's what you're about, right? And so if we're going to be like Bartimaeus, we need to know who Jesus is. This needs to be a place where we're continually reminded, this is Jesus. He's the plan of God. He's the one who frees us from our greatest oppressor, sin, right? And he's God himself. All those things that Bartimaeus saw. So, if you're here, I want you to examine yourself and say, am I taking part in this? Am I a part of the church that is proclaiming who Jesus is? Am I active? And if not, why not? And I challenge you to find something to do to change that, right? We've got to be like Bartimaeus, active in proclaiming who Jesus is, and when people tell us to shh, did Bartimaeus listen? No. He redoubled his efforts and cried out all the louder, Jesus, son of David. Now, Bartimaeus also, he wasn't like me. He wasn't afraid to look at his own game and say, what do I need? When Jesus asked him what he needed, he said, I need to see. I think what we need to do, church, is ask Jesus what we need to see. What is it about how we follow that Jesus needs to change, right? Because if we're going to be good followers, we should look more and more like Jesus every day. And there are people who need us to look more and more like Jesus. They don't need us to look like us, especially the old us that Jesus found and wants to fix, right? They've got plenty of that in their own life. They need us to look more like Jesus. That's what good minor characters do. And so my challenge for you, church, is to wonder, are you being honest in your conversation about how Jesus is changing you? Sometimes we can be really like, oh yeah, Jesus is doing this thing in my life. But when we have to be confronted and realize, wow, I learned this about myself and I need to fix it, are we willing to be honest and genuine with the people who are curious, right? Because I know this about teenagers. They have the best smoke detectors in the world. You're blowing smoke at them, they know, right? You know if I'm being fake with you, right? Like, you can tell. You don't have to, like, as soon as I do, you're like, oh, I'm done listening to this guy, right? You do it with your teachers. You do it with your parents. I know your tricks, right? But you can't get anything past you. If I'm not being genuine with you, you're going to know it. Chances are you've already called it out to one another. And if you're brave enough, you'd be like, hey, Dylan, that was totally fake, right? They're going to know. And so are people who are curious about Jesus. They're going to know when you're being fake with them. Part of the reason why people don't like to learn who Jesus is because sometimes we get this idea that we have to have it all together. Jesus' closest disciples didn't have it all together. The difference between us and them is we should learn to examine our own game and start letting God work on us. And so, church, are you doing that? Are you the type of person who's doing that? And if you're not, what's standing in your way? And then, church, are you someone who's seeking where God's leading you? Individually, in your family, in your church? I know that your church has got a prayer challenge laid out. I laid a little one out for you last week, right? But I know Pastor Ron has laid one out for you too, to get together, to be praying about, what are the next steps for your church. Bartimaeus follows, right? He knows where he needs to follow. He follows the one who saves him, and you're already doing that, but you might be curious, what are the next steps? My challenge for you is to pray about it and see where God's leading. Be an active part in that church. It will be amazing to see what God does in your prayer life and in your church. Now, if you're here and you're curious about Jesus, I always preach with the hope that there's someone who's curious about Jesus, maybe a little suspicious of Jesus. That's a good spot to be. Because Bartimaeus has some challenges for you too. The first one is, do you know who Jesus is? Bartimaeus did, but maybe you need to learn some more. So my challenge for you is, take a look at the book of Mark. It's a very fast-paced gospel. Mark's favorite word is immediately. So it kind of reads like a comic book. You're going to see one scene, then the next scene, then the next scene. And Jesus does some wild stuff, and he's going to show who he is. And he's also going to show how a bunch of his followers still need a lot of work. And so for someone who's curious about Jesus, not sure whether they can approach him, it's a good place to start. If you're here and you're curious about Jesus, what is it that you need? What has driven you to say, maybe I should take a peek at this? Are you willing to examine yourself and say, what's making me curious? And last week I challenged you, even if you were just curious about Jesus, to give prayer a try and see how it worked for you. Well, whatever need brought you to think about Jesus, or whatever situation inspired you to get curious about Jesus, why not pray about that particular situation and see what God does? And then, if you're still curious about Jesus, you might not know how to follow. And that's okay. Bartimaeus probably hasn't followed someone in quite a long time because he couldn't see them to follow them. The disciples that we see here aren't good at following, but yet they still do. And God does amazing things in them. And so, if you're curious about Jesus and not sure how to follow, my challenge for you is to make a connection here with someone you trust who follows Jesus and have them read through Mark with you and to pray with you. So, church, I threw a little extra homework in there for you. If someone gets curious and comes to you, give that a shot. But good minor characters know who Jesus is. They know what they need and they know how to follow him. And so I hope that Bartimaeus inspires you to examine your own game. What do you need? How do you need to look more like Jesus? And what are you going to do about it? You see, if we're people who follow Jesus, our lives should look like hopeful ones. Not irreverently hopeful and not seeing the problems in the world, but seeing what's going on and saying, I still have hope in Christ. Our lives should be joyous, not fake happy. We can't always be happy, but joy is a supernatural emotion because we trust the one who gives us joy. And we don't have to live under our circumstances when we have joy. We can work through them with joy. And so if we're people who know Jesus, people are coming here to find that same hope and joy, could you imagine if we were like Bartimaeus? We were willing to look at our own mistakes and say, Jesus is fixing this in me. And I'm so glad he is. Can I help you get to know how he can fix what's going on in you? That would be an amazing place to be, right? That's what we're here to do. And if we know our own needs, if we're willing to look at our own game and diagnose our own flaws and change our form and look more like Jesus, then you and I, we're not going to be the same person we were yesterday because God's working on us, right? We're not going to be stuck repeating the same old mistakes or falling into the same old traps because God's still working on us and we're following. And if we know how to follow, others are going to want to do it too. And I'm sure you know others need it. So let's be good disciples together. Now, one thing good disciples do together is we maintain our faith, right? The reason we gather together is to stir one another up to love and good works. As my father-in-law would say, sometimes stirring one another up to love and good works is my arm around you. Let's go. Sometimes it's my foot beneath you. Hey, buddy, let's go. Right? But that's what we're here to do. And one way we do that is through communion. We enjoy the Lord's table together as a chance to stop and remember how great his love is for us. That he would shed his blood and let his body be broken so that we didn't have to suffer under the brokenness of sin. So could I ask the gentleman to come forward as we prepare the Lord's table?